In the neglected archives of the Wisconsin Diocese lies a hidden collection of papers, documents the Catholic Church has tried to conceal for over 160 years. Within these aging pages rests an account of systematic disappearances, 23 nuns who vanished without trace from St. Mary's Convent, a solemn institution built near Lake Michigan, between the years 1854 and 1862. For decades, church officials dismissed these troubling records as clerical errors, exaggerations, or simple misinterpretations. Yet the testimonies of 3 independent diocesan inspectors, combined with a bundle of private letters recently uncovered within a sealed wall cavity during renovations, reveal a darker truth. Together, these accounts paint a portrait so chilling, so grotesque, that even hardened historians have struggled to accept it as real. Could such evil have thrived, unchecked, within consecrated walls? What follows is the first full telling of a case many regard as the single most disturbing example of religious corruption in American history, a case the Catholic hierarchy has quietly spent fortunes ensuring the public would never know. But before we return to the grim tale of St. Mary's Convent, I must pause. If you find yourself already unsettled by this opening glimpse, I urge you to subscribe to our channel. Here, we uncover historically accurate accounts of America's darkest religious secrets. Our growing community of truth seekers spans all 50 states and beyond. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let us step back to the Wisconsin countryside of 1854, to the very beginning of the story. That autumn, a thick morning fog clung to Lake Michigan as Bishop William Corder's carriage passed through the iron gates of what was soon to be St. Mary's Convent. The Catholic Church had recently purchased this sprawling property, once a lumber baron's grand mansion, surrounded by 30 acres of dense pine forest. Their intention was clear: to establish the region's first major Catholic institution in a territory that, until then, had been overwhelmingly Protestant. This strategic move was part of a broader campaign to spread Catholic influence across America's rapidly expanding frontier, where Protestant congregations had already taken strong root. The mansion itself, carved from pale limestone, rose from the ground with a commanding presence: 3 massive wings, a bell tower that pierced the sky, and Gothic windows that looked down like watchful eyes upon the countryside. Built in 1842, the central building exuded an eerie grandeur. 2 wings stretched outward, one destined to house the nuns' quarters, the other reserved for an orphanage and an infirmary. Behind the mansion stood a smaller chapel, its sharp spire rising above the trees, visible for miles across the flat Wisconsin plains. But the convent's arrival stirred unease among the local settlers. These were communities of German and Scandinavian descent, mostly Lutheran and Methodist, who lived by simpler traditions of worship. To them, the black habits of the nuns, their Irish accents, and the mysterious rituals of Catholicism were foreign, threatening even. On the day of consecration, a small but tense crowd formed beyond the gates. "Papists," muttered Elijah Hoffman, a respected elder of the Lutheran Church, glaring at the black-robed procession disappearing into the chapel. "They'll corrupt our children with their idolatry." His neighbor Wilhelm Schmidt, whose family had fled Catholic persecution in Germany, nodded bitterly. "They've followed us even here." Though not all Protestants shared these feelings, such hostility would form the backdrop for the tragedy soon to unfold. Inside the chapel, Bishop Corder declared proudly, "St. Mary shall stand as a beacon of God's mercy in this wilderness." His words rang against the bare stone walls, where morning sunlight, filtered through modest stained glass, painted patterns of red and blue across the pews. Under the leadership of Mother Superior Catherine Murphy, the bishop promised, the convent would bring hope, shelter for orphans, comfort for widows, and healing for the sick. Then he introduced the 3 women chosen to lead this new religious community. Mother Superior Catherine, tall, disciplined, and commanding at 42, wore her black habit with authority. Her piercing pale blue eyes seemed to see through any falsehood. Some said her hands, graceful yet firm, looked equally suited to cradle a child or correct an errant novice. Beside her stood Sister Elizabeth Foster, 38, destined to oversee the orphanage. Round-faced, gentle, and perpetually smiling, her soft voice and careful words inspired trust, though some later suspected her warmth concealed a calculating nature. Then came Sister Margaret Clark, 35, the infirmary's future matron. Thin, serious, and meticulous, she carried herself like a physician, her dark eyes sharp and unblinking. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and modern medicine had already earned respect from doctors in Boston and New York. Behind these leaders stood 20 novices, most barely out of their teens. Fresh from Ireland, their faces were solemn, though their eyes occasionally betrayed youthful uncertainty. Among them were Sister Agnes O'Connor, Sister Bernadette Walsh, Sister Teresa Donovan, and Sister Mary Collins, young women who had left behind everything familiar to dedicate themselves to God in a distant land. That first night, after the bishop's blessing, the convent gathered in the refectory. Candles flickered against the stone walls, their shadows stretching long and thin. Mother Catherine addressed her sisters, "The Lord has called us to this wilderness. We will endure hardship unlike any faced by our sisters in the East. We will meet suspicion, hostility, and fear. But through devotion and sacrifice, we will prevail." Later, in the dormitory, whispers broke the silence as the novices prepared for bed. Sister Agnes asked quietly, "Do you think the locals will ever accept us?" Her voice trembled. Sister Bernadette squeezed her hand. "In time. They once feared our Lord too. We must show them through kindness." Their hushed conversation ended abruptly as footsteps echoed in the corridor, Mother Catherine, inspecting her flock, ensuring obedience from the very first night. Within weeks, the convent settled into its strict rhythm. The bells summoned the sisters from their narrow beds at 3 in the morning for matins. Latin chants echoed through the chapel 7 times each day, mingling with the natural sounds of wind in the trees and distant cattle calls. Between prayers, the sisters tended the orphanage, cared for the sick, and maintained vegetable gardens that sustained the community. Every hour was regimented: prayer, labor, simple meals, short recreation, then prayer again. It was a rhythm meant to silence the self, to break down individuality, and to fix every heart and mind upon God. And yet, beneath this facade of order and devotion, something far darker would soon begin to take root within St. Mary's. By the winter of 1854, the orphanage at St. Mary's had taken in 12 children, most of them the sons and daughters of Irish immigrant laborers who had perished in railroad or lumber accidents. Sister Elizabeth presided over their care with outward warmth, teaching them their letters and numbers while steadily weaving Catholic doctrine into their lessons. On Sundays, after Mass, families from the surrounding countryside sometimes visited, bringing small gifts, apples, sweets, or knitted mittens, for the orphans, and occasionally inquiring about adoption. Sister Margaret's infirmary, though modest at first, soon earned respect even among skeptical neighbors. Her remedies, poultices for swelling, teas for fever, compresses for congested chests, proved remarkably effective during Wisconsin's brutal winters, when traveling to distant physicians could mean risking one's life on snow-choked roads. In time, even the most doubtful locals began to acknowledge the convent's usefulness. "They keep to themselves, but they do good work," admitted Elijah Hoffman, the same Lutheran elder who had once scorned them, after Sister Margaret's treatment cured his grandson's relentless cough. "Their ways are not our ways," he told his congregation, "but perhaps this vast country has room for more than one path to heaven." Among the youngest of the community was Sister Agnes O'Connor, just 23 years old. Her letters home to Ireland, preserved today in the Dublin Diocesan Archives, offer a rare first-hand account of the convent's early months. Written in a neat, careful hand, they initially carry the tone of a dutiful novice, but close reading reveals subtle shifts as her enthusiasm gave way to exhaustion. "The work is harder than I ever imagined," she confessed in December of 1854, the ink blotched with faint smudges that suggest her tears had stained the page. "My hands are raw from washing linens in icy water, and the chapel stones feel like ice beneath our knees during morning prayers. But Mother Catherine assures us that such sacrifices bring joy to God." She went on to describe Sister Elizabeth's kindness, how she would quietly leave an extra blanket on Agnes's bed during the coldest nights, and how patient she was in teaching her to care for the orphans. She praised Sister Margaret's skill as well, recalling how a fever nearly swept through the orphanage that autumn. "The children burned with such heat we feared they would all be taken from us, but her willow bark tincture with honey lowered their temperatures. I believe we are truly doing God's work here, though I confess I still cry myself to sleep, longing for the green hills of home. What the letters do not say, and what Sister Agnes herself may not have fully understood, was that life inside St. Mary's was already changing. Mother Catherine, whose discipline had once seemed merely strict, began drifting toward harsh authoritarianism. Small breaches of conduct were now met with punishments that verged on cruelty. One January evening in 1855, Sister Josephine Brady, her hands trembling as she tried to mend a tear in her habit, bore the marks of such discipline. For the simple offense of coughing during silent prayer, she had been forced to kneel on dried peas while reciting the entire rosary, a punishment so severe it left her knees raw and bleeding. Sister Mary Collins tried quietly to help her thread the needle, their eyes meeting in silent solidarity. But Mother Catherine's voice pierced the hush of the workroom. Do not coddle weakness. Discipline is the cornerstone of devotion. Each of you should remember this. Her sudden appearances, soundless and severe, unsettled the novices more with each passing day. Outwardly, however, the convent's reputation flourished. When a measles outbreak ravaged the lumber camps in the spring of 1855, Sister Margaret's infirmary treated dozens of men, Catholic and Protestant alike. Donations began trickling in from grateful families, and even local ministers conceded that good work was being done behind those imposing limestone walls. But inside, the atmosphere grew steadily darker. Communal meals once filled with soft conversation had fallen into tense silence, the sisters staring down at bowls of thin broth and coarse bread. Recreation hours, once a time of gentle laughter, were now stiff and muted. The young women who had once been bound by shared sacrifice and faith began moving like shadows, each careful not to draw unwanted attention. The first disappearance came in April of 1855. Sister Agnes did not appear for morning prayers. Her absence was instantly noticeable, one empty place among the line of 20. During breakfast, Mother Catherine explained calmly, Sister Agnes has been called to assist our mission in Minnesota. Her departure was sudden, as these callings often are. We shall all pray for her success. A clatter broke the silence. Sister Bernadette Walsh had dropped her spoon. But Mother, she stammered, she said nothing to me, and she stopped at once under the Mother Superior's gaze. Are you suggesting, Sister Bernadette, Catherine asked coolly, that a bride of Christ must seek approval from her equals before obeying her superiors? The question lingered like frost in the air. No, Mother. Forgive me, Bernadette murmured, lowering her eyes to her untouched porridge. No one had seen Agnes pack. No farewell letters were sent. Her few belongings, a prayer book, a wooden rosary from her mother, her woolen stockings, were gone. Yet Sister Mary Collins, whose cot lay beside hers, whispered later in the garden to Sister Teresa Donovan, her cloak still hangs on its peg. Would she have gone to Minnesota without it, in April? Teresa's eyes darted nervously toward the convent windows. Perhaps she was given a new one, she whispered. We should not question. 3 months later, Sister Bernadette herself vanished. The bishop has requested her assistance in Chicago, Mother Catherine announced. She departed at dawn to establish procedures at the Newfoundland home. Sister Elizabeth added reassurance, her voice steady though her eyes were strangely cold. The bishop recognizes her gift with children. It is only right she use it where she is most needed. By the end of that winter, 3 more nuns had vanished in the same fashion. Always the young, the gentle, the admired. Always without warning. Always explained away as transfers to distant missions. Letters sent by families to these new locations returned with short, formal replies that, decades later, handwriting experts determined had all been written by the same person, not by the missing women themselves. Only one among the sisters, the strong-willed Teresa Donovan, tall, broad-shouldered from her years of farm work, showed the courage to give voice to what others only dared to think. Mother Catherine's intolerance for questions had grown notorious, but it was Sister Teresa Donovan who finally voiced what many dared only whisper. It seems odd that Rome would order so many transfers with so little documentation, she murmured to Sister Mary Collins one humid afternoon in the summer of 1856. They knelt together in the garden, fingers stained from harvesting carrots. The convent had recently expanded the plots, and beyond the vegetable rows stood a new enclosure, a fenced-off section of medicinal herbs tended exclusively by Sister Margaret under Mother Catherine's watchful eye. No other nun was permitted inside. Teresa's voice dropped lower, her Irish brogue thickening with frustration. "And have you noticed it's always the youngest, the prettiest who are called away? Agnes with her golden hair, Bernadette with her singing voice, Catherine with her flawless complexion, Josephine with her—" She broke off abruptly as a shadow stretched across the soil. Sister Mary glanced nervously toward the convent windows. Sister Margaret stood there, her face unreadable, eyes fixed on them. "Mother Catherine has her reasons," Mary whispered sharply. "We must trust her wisdom." A week later, Teresa herself was gone. At morning prayers, the explanation was delivered with chilling composure. She had been called to a contemplative retreat in Montreal. Sister Mary, now gripped by silent terror, lowered her head and said nothing. That evening, however, as she prepared her narrow bed, she discovered a slip of paper tucked beneath her pillow, a torn page from Teresa's prayer book. Scrawled across the margin in hurried ink were the words, "Something is wrong. If I disappear, tell Father Ryan." The sight of her friend's trembling handwriting, the ink still fresh, sent a cold dread through Mary's body that no draught of winter air could match. By 1857, the pattern was undeniable within the convent's walls. Of the original 20 junior nuns, only 12 remained. Outwardly, the community still appeared intact. The orphanage bustled, the infirmary treated the sick, and the solemn processions continued each Sunday. To visiting families, St. Mary's looked like a place of order, charity, and holy devotion. But inside, fear had become as palpable as the damp chill that seeped from the stone walls. The remaining sisters spoke only in whispers. They avoided solitude. They counted heads in chapel, dreading the next empty place in the line. Mother Catherine's rule grew even harsher. Small infractions drew brutal penances, days of fasting, nights of sleepless prayer on the cold floor, public confessions of humiliating sins. Sister Claire O'Donnell, caught with a piece of chocolate sent by her family, was forced to kneel before the entire convent and denounce herself as gluttonous and deceitful. Her punishment, 3 days of near starvation, water and a single crust of bread for sustenance. On the second day she collapsed during prayers, her body crumpling against the pews. It was Sister Margaret who revived her with smelling salts, and some swore they glimpsed the faintest curve of a smile on her thin lips as Claire gasped back to consciousness. Then came the night that shattered Sister Mary's last illusions. In January of 1858, she woke to muffled sounds in the adjoining cell. Through the thin partition, she recognized Sister Rebecca Murphy's voice, ragged with sobs. Then came a sharp whisper, Mother Catherine's unmistakable tone, "You will come with us now. Make any noise, and you will regret it." Mary froze, every muscle rigid. She counted the footsteps in the corridor, 1, 2, 3 sets moving away from Rebecca's door. Then a muffled cry, quickly stifled, followed by the unmistakable drag of a body across wooden planks. Silence swallowed the hall. At breakfast, Mother Catherine addressed the community with the same calm authority. "Sister Rebecca has been summoned to a mission in the Dakota Territory," she announced. "Her patience with the orphans has prepared her for teaching the native children. We shall miss her gentle spirit but rejoice in her service to God." Her pale eyes swept the refectory, pausing on Sister Mary long enough to make her blood run cold. Mary endured morning prayers with trembling hands, her rosary beads clicking between her fingers as her thoughts raced. What became of Rebecca? What of all the others? That afternoon, as she swept the corridor outside Mother Catherine's office, she heard voices through the heavy door left slightly ajar. She froze, broom in hand. "This one will fetch a higher price," said Sister Elizabeth, her voice stripped of its usual softness. "The doctor says men pay extra for the innocent ones." Glass clinked, Sister Margaret's voice followed. "We must pace ourselves. 3 in a single month has drawn attention." The bishop's secretary remarked on it in his last letter. "The bishop is easily managed," Mother Catherine replied, her laugh low and dismissive. "Another donation to his cathedral fund, and his questions will vanish. We've laid the pattern well enough. No one doubts that nuns are sent to frontier missions, or that some fall ill while serving the poor. A pause. Then Sister Margaret again, voice dropping to a whisper. What of the Collins girl? She watches too closely. I've seen her listening at doors. The silence that followed made Mary's heart pound so violently she feared they might hear it. Finally, Mother Catherine spoke. We'll wait. She's too plain to command much value, and her brother's letters from seminary draw attention. Too many vanishings at once could invite scrutiny. Rebecca will keep the doctor's clients satisfied for now. Mary stumbled away before her shaking legs betrayed her. Her mind spun, each missing piece snapping into place, the disappearances, the secrecy, the sudden wealth of donations, the well-dressed strangers who occasionally toured the convent in the company of Mother Catherine. A horrifying picture emerged. The missing nuns had not gone to missions. They had not fallen ill. They had been sold. The chapel was colder than the rest of the convent, its stone walls leaching away the weak warmth of early spring. Father Ryan knelt briefly before the altar, bowing his head while his eyes moved discreetly across the dim interior. Something was wrong here too. The silver candlesticks, polished to a dull gleam, were new and costly. The embroidered altar cloth bore threads of gold, the kind of work that no humble convent could afford without wealthy patrons. And yet the pews showed little wear, as though few ever knelt in them. At the rear of the chapel a heavy oak door drew his attention. It was bolted, the iron latch new and gleaming compared to the weathered wood. What lies beyond there? Father Ryan asked casually, rising to his feet. Sister Elizabeth stiffened. The sacristy, Father. Only the Mother Superior has the key. It is where sacred vessels are stored. You understand, of course. He nodded, though unease curled in his stomach. The door was too large for a sacristy. And beneath the faint smell of incense lingered another odor, sharp and metallic, like old blood and something chemical he could not name. When he pressed further, Elizabeth guided him quickly toward the exit, her voice too bright. Mother Catherine will see that you receive the financial ledgers by week's end, Father. We will not trouble you further. But Father Ryan did not leave. Instead, under the pretense of retrieving his gloves, he lingered at the entryway until the sisters dispersed. Only when the corridor was silent did he return to the chapel. His hands shook as he pressed his ear against the bolted door. At first nothing, then, faintly, a sound that turned his blood cold. A muffled sob. He stumbled back, nearly knocking over a candlestand. The sob was followed by a scraping noise, then silence again. That night Father Ryan wrote a long letter by candlelight in his parish house, his pen scratching furiously across the page. He recorded everything, the note from Sister Mary, the dwindling numbers, the strange wealth, the lies, the sounds behind the chapel door. He sealed the letter with his parish seal and addressed it to an old seminary friend now working for the New York Catholic Register. If the bishop would not listen, perhaps the press would. Before posting the letter, however, he resolved to return. He needed proof, something undeniable that could not be brushed aside as rumor. And so, on the night of April 2, 1858, Father Ryan returned to St. Mary's under cover of darkness. The sky was low and heavy with clouds, muffling the moonlight, and the convent loomed against the horizon like a fortress. He carried only a lantern and a small crowbar tucked beneath his cloak. The sisters' quarters were dark, their windows blank eyes. He slipped across the garden, the scent of damp earth and medicinal herbs rising around him, until he reached the side entrance that opened near the chapel. Inside, the convent was silent but for the distant creak of beams in the night wind. He moved quickly, heart pounding, until he stood once more before the bolted oak door. For a long moment he hesitated, sweat cold against his back. Then he slid the crowbar beneath the latch and pressed. The bolt groaned, resisted, then gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. Father Ryan froze, breath held, lantern lowered. But no footsteps came. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The smell struck him first. Not incense, not old wood, but a sickly mixture of laudanum, carbolic, and decay. His lantern beam wavered across the stone chamber beyond, illuminating rows of narrow pallets. On each pallet lay the form of a young woman, unmoving, some clad in half-removed habits, others in simple shifts. Their skin was pale, almost waxen, lips parted as if in unnatural sleep. At the far end of the room, shelves lined with bottles and instruments gleamed in the lamplight. And beside them, a wooden crate stood open, packed with fine linens and small silver chalices, items that had no place here. Then one of the women moved. A faint whimper escaped her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with drugged stupor. "Help, me!" Father Ryan staggered back, nearly dropping his lantern. The truth, terrible and undeniable, stood before him. But a new sound made his blood run cold, the echo of footsteps behind him, measured and deliberate, entering the chapel. "Father Ryan," came Mother Catherine's voice, calm and clear in the darkness. "I had hoped your zeal would not make you foolish." Sister Elizabeth's composure cracked slightly, her lips trembling as though torn between loyalty and conscience. Her eyes flickered toward the heavy iron lock, then back to Monsignor Kelly. For a brief second, Father Ryan thought she might produce a key. Instead, she shook her head violently, her voice breaking. "I cannot, Monsignor. Please, you do not understand what you're asking." Her trembling hands made the sign of the cross, but she did not move aside. Monsignor Kelly's weathered face hardened. "Then you leave me no choice." He turned to Father Ryan, who produced the crowbar he had concealed beneath his cloak. At Kelly's nod, Ryan wedged the iron into the lock. With a grunt and the crack of splintering wood, the door gave way, swinging inward with a slow groan that seemed to echo through the entire convent. The smell struck them instantly. A rancid mix of laudanum, sweat, and something far fouler, something that whispered of rot. Father Ryan lifted his lantern high. The chamber beyond was a long, low room lined with pallets. On them lay women, half-conscious, pale, their habits in disarray. Some stirred weakly at the light, others only moaned. Shackles clinked faintly as one reached out a trembling hand. "Merciful God," Monsignor Kelly whispered, crossing himself. One of the women, her eyes sunken and glassy, whispered hoarsely, "Father, please, take us away." At the far end of the chamber, shelves held glass bottles, surgical instruments, and ledgers bound in cracked leather. The priests stepped forward, their faces pale as parchment. Father Ryan flipped one ledger open. Inside, neat columns recorded dates, descriptions, and names, the missing sisters, with figures scrawled beside them. The entries read more like inventory than a register of souls. Monsignor Kelly slammed the book shut, his hands trembling. "This is not merely sin," he said in a low, furious voice. "This is commerce. Human souls sold under the guise of holy vows." Before he could say more, a sudden crash rang out behind them. The sound of boots. Callahan, the burly enforcer, stormed down the corridor, his face flushed with rage. Behind him came Mother Catherine herself, her eyes burning with an intensity that bordered on madness. "You fools," she hissed, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Do you think Rome will believe you over me? Do you think the bishop will sacrifice his cathedral for a handful of hysterical girls?" Monsignor Kelly stepped between her and the chamber, his stature commanding. "In the name of the Archbishop of New York, I place this convent under immediate ecclesiastical investigation. You, Mother Catherine, are relieved of your office." For the first time, Catherine's mask cracked. A flicker of desperation crossed her features. She raised one hand as though in benediction, but her voice was venomous. "You meddle in affairs you cannot comprehend. These women were wasted behind these walls. We gave them purpose. We gave them value. Do you not see? The Church itself profits." Callahan longed forward, but one of the senior priests grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the wall and struck him across the shoulder. The brute stumbled, cursing, his bulk crashing against the stone. Screams erupted from deeper in the convent as other sisters realized what was happening. Some fled. Others fell to their knees in prayer. Father Ryan rushed to the nearest pallet, helping a young nun sit upright. Her wrists bore raw red marks where restraints had chafed. "You are safe now, sister," he whispered, though he wasn't sure it was true. Behind him, Monsignor Kelly barked orders: "Seal the gates. Fetch the sheriff. Not one soul leaves these grounds until this is answered for." But as chaos filled St. Mary's, Mother Catherine slipped into the shadows of the north wing. Her final words lingered in the air like smoke. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Mother Catherine did not flinch when the sheriff's men entered the convent to take her into custody. She stood at the head of the refectory table, hands folded, her face an impassive mask of pale serenity. Only her eyes betrayed her, the cold glint of defiance that made even the seasoned deputies hesitate. "Mother Catherine," the sheriff intoned, "by order of the Archbishop of Milwaukee and the civil authorities of this county, you are hereby placed under arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, unlawful imprisonment, and," he faltered, glancing down at the list, "murder." The silence that followed was suffocating. The surviving nuns, huddled near the back wall, clutched one another like frightened children. Some crossed themselves. Others wept quietly. Catherine's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Murder," she said softly. "And yet you found no body worth naming. No corpse with a name to attach to your accusation. Only bones and soil and frightened girls eager to please their rescuers." Her voice rose, steady, commanding, as though she still presided over them. "You dare call yourselves servants of God, yet you know nothing of His designs. This house has served a greater purpose than any of you can imagine." When the deputies bound her wrists with iron cuffs, she made no move to resist, but turned her gaze upon Father Ryan. "You think you've saved them," she whispered as they pushed her toward the door, "but you've merely shifted them from one cage to another. The world will devour them, Father. At least here they had meaning." Sister Elizabeth, standing nearby, crumpled into sobs at those words. Unlike Catherine, she did not maintain her composure. Under the weight of interrogation and the sight of her fallen empire, she broke down, confessing in halting fragments. She admitted to forging official letters from the bishop's chancery, arranging the transports of both nuns and orphan girls, and handling the money that passed through their stained hands. She described in grisly detail how the infants born of violated sisters were spirited away, their baptisms falsified in parish registers, their small bodies handed over to strangers with gold coins pressed into her palm. The townspeople, once respectful of the convent, now gathered in stunned silence outside its stone walls as word of the revelation spread. Fathers clutched their sons' shoulders. Mothers pulled their daughters closer. Old men shook their heads, muttering that they had known something was wrong when the bells stopped ringing at odd hours. As the wagons carrying the surviving sisters rolled past, gaunt faces peering through thin veils, women wept openly while men removed their hats and bowed their heads. What had once seemed a fortress of holiness now looked to them like a crypt of corruption. The following dawn, Monsignor Kelly stood in the convent garden with the sheriff and a team of laborers. One by one, spades struck soil, tearing up the vegetable plots that for years had produced food for the sisters and townsfolk alike. The first discovery came within an hour, a pale hand, fingers twisted, clutching rosary beads that had long since rusted. Then another, a length of bone, fragments of habit fabric still clinging to it. Each new revelation was met with bowed heads, whispered prayers, and grim silence. Father Ryan turned away at the sight of a small skull, too small to belong to any grown sister. "Infants," Monsignor Kelly said hoarsely. His old hands shook as he made the sign of the cross. "God forgive us for not seeing sooner." When the spades uncovered a rosary inscribed with the initials T.D., Sister Claire O'Donnell collapsed in tears. "Teresa," she sobbed, "it's Sister Teresa Donovan. She fought until the very end." The laborers, hardened men used to graves, looked away in shame. Within days, the Archbishop issued a decree suppressing St. Mary's Convent. Its name was stricken from diocesan rolls, its gates locked, its buildings sealed with heavy chains. Guards patrolled the grounds to prevent any removal of evidence. The surviving imposters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret, were transported under armed escort to Milwaukee, where both civil magistrates and ecclesiastical judges would sit in judgment. Callahan, their brutish accomplice, spat curses and blasphemies as chains dragged across the cobbles behind him. But among the piles of seized letters and half-burned journals lay hints of something more disturbing still. Monsignor Kelly, hunched over a desk in the bishop's chancery, deciphered scraps of correspondence written in a variety of hands but with a recurring cipher. The words House of Charity appeared again and again, alongside names of cities far beyond Wisconsin: Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, even New Orleans. Each line suggested a network, a lattice of hidden convents where the same vile commerce flourished. "This is but one house among many," Kelly whispered, his voice trembling. He looked at Father Ryan, who stood pale beside him. "One serpent's head cut away, but the body stretches across this land." Ryan swallowed hard. "And if we hunt it? Then we will find that the devil does not rest in one cloister," Kelly replied. "He has scattered his seeds, and men with money water them well." The Monsignor closed the ledger with shaking hands. For the first time since entering holy orders, he felt the weight of true dread, a darkness not confined to one convent but coiling through the very heart of Christendom in the New World. The tragedy of Sister Josephine marked a turning point in the way St. Mary's was remembered. Though the church hierarchy labored to bury every trace of scandal, the local community could not so easily forget. Farmers refused to till the fields adjacent to the former convent, claiming their oxen balked and their plows broke in inexplicable ways whenever they attempted to turn the soil where the gardens had been. Children whispered of seeing ghostly women drifting across the ruins at dusk, pale faces framed in ruined veils, rosaries clutched in skeletal hands. Some swore the faint tolling of a bell could still be heard on windless nights, even though the bell tower had been dismantled stone by stone. Newspapers of the day, largely muzzled by both church influence and civic pressure, carried only short notices of the convent's closure. But in the taverns of Milwaukee and along the riverboats of Chicago, the tale spread like wildfire. Sailors spoke of the nun trade, a shadowy commerce that made men rich on the degradation of women who had sworn themselves to God. Each retelling added lurid detail, some fanciful, others all too close to the truth. The scandal became a kind of frontier legend, half-whispered warning, half-morbid entertainment, told with lowered voices to wide-eyed listeners who crossed themselves instinctively at the conclusion. Archbishop Hughes, though outwardly stern and determined to preserve the church's integrity, carried the weight of the St. Mary's revelations to his grave. His private journals, sealed for a century, contain anguished entries written in a shaky hand. "I have gazed into a pit," he wrote in June 1858, "and seen within it not only corruption but something darker, an organized evil that wears piety as its mask. We closed one house, but how many remain? How many still suffer even now, unseen, unheard?" Monsignor Kelly continued his investigations quietly, traveling under assumed pretexts to cities named in the seized ledgers. In Chicago he traced faint trails to a shuttered medical office once belonging to Dr. Matthews, but the man himself had vanished. Rumors placed him in Havana, working as a ship's surgeon on vessels carrying human cargo of a different kind. In St. Louis, Kelly discovered a boarding house reputed to be owned by a widow from Boston whose description bore unsettling resemblance to Mother Catherine. Each lead ended the same way: doors closed, tongues silenced, suspects vanished just before capture. It was as though the perpetrators anticipated every move, aided by men of influence whose names could not safely be spoken aloud. The surviving victims of St. Mary's bore their scars in silence. Sister Claire O'Donnell, though young, never fully recovered from what she had witnessed. Records show she transferred between convents repeatedly, unable to settle, before disappearing from church rolls entirely in 1867. Whether she left religious life voluntarily or fell victim to the same network that had claimed her sisters remains a mystery. Others succumbed to illness or despair, their deaths recorded in dry convent registers with no hint of the torment that had shaped their final years. By the 1880s, St. Mary's had become a ghost story recounted by locals to frighten children into obedience. The stone foundations of the convent, left to crumble, became a gathering place for youths who dared one another to enter the ruins after sunset. Some claimed to hear chanting echoing from beneath the earth, as those secret passages still carried the voices of the dead. One farmer swore that his lantern extinguished itself each time he crossed the property line, though no wind stirred. When his youngest daughter fell ill and died suddenly, he abandoned his farm altogether, insisting the land was cursed. Yet fragments of the truth refused to remain buried. In 1894, a young historian named Thomas Whitaker uncovered portions of Sister Elizabeth's notebook, preserved in diocesan archives under lock and key. Though heavily redacted, the surviving passages horrified him. In a letter to a colleague he wrote, "I fear that we have underestimated the scale of the horror. These women were not anomalies but instruments of a machine. The ledgers speak of networks too vast, payments too regular, to have been the invention of 3 imposters alone. There was method in their depravity, an organization, perhaps, hidden beneath the very edifice of charity." Whitaker died suddenly in 1896, reportedly of fever, though rumors persisted that his research had drawn the wrong kind of attention. His unfinished manuscript disappeared from his rooms, never to be recovered. And still the shadow of the master lingered. No record ever revealed his name, no document his hand, yet in scattered correspondence across the Midwest appear oblique references: the Bostonian, the overseer, the patron of brides. Whether a single individual or a symbol for the network's hidden power remains uncertain. Some scholars argue he was a fabrication of traumatized minds seeking to embody their torment in a singular figure. Others whisper that the master was real, a man of influence who pulled threads from behind velvet curtains, a name too dangerous to write even in code. By the turn of the 20th century, the land where St. Mary's once stood had been purchased for a sawmill, its ruins erased. Yet workers there complained of unease, of tools that went missing, of strange women glimpsed among the stacks of lumber. A foreman, skeptical of such tales, ordered an old well filled in. When laborers lowered buckets of gravel, they struck not water but bone. The discovery was hushed, the remains quietly reburied elsewhere, but whispers spread again that the convent's dead still reached from the earth, unwilling to rest. Thus the story of St. Mary's slipped into the half-light of history, too dangerous to publish openly, too haunting to forget entirely. The Church never reopened a convent on that ground. The faithful avoided it long after the sawmill closed. And in old diaries, in dusty archives, in marginal notes scribbled by priests and historians who dared to look too closely, the same conclusion appears again and again: what was uncovered in Wisconsin was but the surface of something vast, something organized, something still waiting to be fully named. Sister Unsolved, however, channeled her trauma into advocacy, working within the constraints of her vows and the Church's desire for silence. She quietly established informal support networks for nuns who had suffered abuse. Her correspondence with a Jesuit priest in Boston, later uncovered in the 1930s, suggests that she maintained secret contact with dozens of women across several states, each of them bearing their own stories of coercion, violence, and betrayal within these letters and described. Her mission not as rebellion against the Church but as fidelity to the gospel, insisting that the truth of Christ required defending the vulnerable even when those responsible for harm wore cassocks or veils. In one particularly striking passage she wrote, "They told us obedience was the highest virtue, but I believe now that obedience without conscience is the pathway to hell." Sister Rebecca, now Rachel Martin, had attempted to sound the alarm through her writing but sought to preserve the lives of those still within religious communities. Her survival networks became lifelines, providing food, safe lodging, and sympathetic confessors to women who fled dangerous convents. Despite her efforts, Anne's work remained hidden and unacknowledged by official church records. For nearly 2 decades she continued to minister to wounded souls under the shadow of silence. Dying in 1878 of influenza, her papers, smuggled out of her convent by a trusted novice, were preserved in a private family collection, only surfacing in 1972 when a descendant donated them to a small Catholic college there. Publication revealed not only the scale of the trauma but also the quiet heroism of a woman determined to resist evil without abandoning her vows. Her testimony lent further weight to historians who by then had begun re-evaluating 19th-century convent life as not merely pious seclusion but a contested space where power, gender, and secrecy often intersected in dangerous ways. the memory of St. Mary's lingered like an unhealed wound in the communities touched by it in Wisconsin. Descendants of the families who had lost daughters to the convent whispered stories of girls who vanished into holy orders and were never heard from again. Parish registers revealed abrupt gaps in baptismal sponsors and confirmations, suggesting that questions persisted long after the official investigation ended. The church's refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing created a vacuum that folklore quickly filled. Some claimed that the limestone walls of the convent still held the cries of the missing, that their shadows crossed the chapel floor during midnight prayers. Others believed that divine judgment fell upon those responsible, pointing to the strange decline of Mother Catherine, whose health failed rapidly after her imprisonment. Contemporary accounts describe her as raving in her final days, muttering about debts unpaid and faces watching her from the walls. She died in 1862 officially of fever, but her jailers claimed she refused food and water, insisting that poisoned souls had taken root in her stomach. Yet for all the whispered legends and fragmentary testimonies, the deeper truth remained buried, suppressed by church archives, destroyed books, and vanished witnesses. It was only in the late 20th century when scholars pieced together Rachel Martin's suppressed text, Father Ryan's journals, and in Sullivan's letters that a fuller picture emerged. What was once dismissed as anti-Catholic hysteria revealed itself as a genuine tragedy of exploitation concealed beneath sacred ritual. By then the last direct survivors were long gone, their names reduced to footnotes, their faces lost to fading daguerreotypes. Still the record stands, a grim reminder of what can flourish in shadows when power hides behind holiness. St. Mary's may have been demolished, its stones scattered into farmhouses and boundary walls, but the voices of its victims echo through history, demanding to be heard. The final lesson they leave us is stark silence protects the powerful, but testimony, however fragile, keeps memory alive. The plea of Father Ryan did not end with the ink of his journal. It echoed across decades, surfacing whenever historians, reformers, or survivors sought to understand the quiet devastation hidden within religious walls. The case of St. Mary's became a spectral presence in American religious history, rarely spoken of in official sermons but whispered about in reform circles. Protestant critics used it as evidence of Catholic corruption, while Catholic defenders dismissed it as nativist invention. Yet the fragments that remain tell a story that is both darker and more complicated than either polemic suggested. What happened in that stone convent was not merely the product of three women's depravity, but a convergence of frontier isolation, insufficient oversight, and a culture of obedience that left the most vulnerable without recourse. St. Mary's revealed the paradox of 19th-century religious life. Institutions created to protect the weak sometimes became the very places where the weak were most at risk. The survivors who carried fragments of that story into the wider world left an enduring legacy, even if their names faded into obscurity. Rachel Martin with her suppressed book, and Sullivan with her hidden network, Sister Claire with her broken dreams, and Father Ryan with his tormented conscience, each bore witness in their own imperfect way. The church may have sought to erase the record, but memory is more resilient than stone. Daguerreotypes crumble, paper burns, graves are paved over, but stories endure, especially stories rooted in suffering that demands remembrance. Each retelling, whether in whispered family anecdotes, yellowing newsprint, or rediscovered letters, binds the present to the pain of the past. The lesson lingers uncomfortably that silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. The question of numbers continues to haunt scholars and families alike. Was it 40 lives stolen, 60, 100 more? The records are contradictory, the archives incomplete, the witnesses silenced or dead. Sister Elizabeth's cold notation of rural acquisitions suggests that the true toll may never be calculated. Her casual reference to 14 girls in a single year reduced to entries on a ledger speaks volumes about the commodification of human beings under the cloak of sacred vows. These were not nameless statistics, but daughters of farmers, singers of hymns, novices who once believed they were brides of Christ, reduced to inventory by women who vowed chastity, poverty, and obedience. They became currency in a marketplace of hidden desire. What became of Mother Catherine Murphy and Catherine Donovan alias Sister Margaret remains one of the darkest unanswered questions of American religious history. The trail through New Orleans, Havana, and Veracruz reads like a criminal pilgrimage masked by rosaries and prayers. The detectives' warning that they enjoyed protection at the highest levels of society underscores the chilling reach of their influence, that they could vanish so completely, leaving behind only rumors of a finishing school. Suggests complicity not only from corrupt patrons but perhaps from churchmen themselves. Whether they died in obscurity or continued their predations under new names, we cannot know. What is certain is that their shadow lingers, a reminder that evil often thrives not in open defiance but in mimicry of holiness. By the 20th century, St. Mary's had become less a memory than a ghost. Its ruins erased its story, absent from catechisms and histories, yet each rediscovered letter, each surviving testimony, each uncovered report tears at the veil of silence. In the 1970s, when the sealed documents of Archbishop Hughes and the detectives' reports surfaced, historians could finally weave together what survivors had always known: the abuse was systemic, the cover-up deliberate, the silence catastrophic. The parallels with later revelations of abuse within Catholic institutions were too stark to ignore. St. Mary's was not an aberration but an early blueprint. Today, suburban homes stand where the convent once rose, their lawns trim, their driveways neat. Families live unaware upon the bones of the forgotten. Their children ride bicycles over ground once soaked with fear. Few know that beneath the manicured grass lies a history of prayer and betrayal, suffering and silence. Some nights neighbors claim to hear strange echoes from the soil, a woman's voice singing in a language they cannot place. Others dismiss it as the wind through the pines. Yet for those who know the fragments, the thought persists that the land remembers even when people try to forget. The legacy of St. Mary's is not merely a story of Catholic failure, it is a human warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, about the ease with which obedience can become a weapon, and about the desperate resilience of those who refuse to remain silent. Father Ryan's final words, remember them, still hang like a commandment. They are addressed not just to the Church but to all of us who inherit the world shaped by such histories. To remember is not to dwell morbidly on past horrors but to recognize the structures that allowed them to flourish and to ensure they are never repeated. Silence once enabled. St. Mary's testimony can prevent another. And so we speak their names: Sister Agnes, Sister Bernarde, Sister Teresa, Sister Catherine, Sister Josephine, Sister Rebecca, Sister Claire, Sister Maria, Sister Anne, and the many unnamed daughters of the frontier. Their stories, partial and fragmented, still reach across centuries, calling for acknowledgement. If stones can be scattered and graves erased, then words must become their memorial. Through them the dark convent is never wholly forgotten. Through them perhaps the innocent, once silenced, finally find a measure of justice. The phrase "he comes tonight" has fueled speculation for more than a century. Who was the mysterious master repeatedly referenced in Sister Elizabeth's ravings and James Callahan's prison confession? Was he a symbolic figure, an invention used to terrify subordinates into obedience, or was he a flesh and blood patron whose wealth and power extended protection to the network that flourished in the shadows? Some historians argue the master was simply a cipher for collective guilt or demonic imagery borrowed from Catholic lore. Others, however, point to circumstantial evidence suggesting a high-ranking political or ecclesiastical figure whose identity was carefully shielded by the destruction of key documents. A handful of letters surviving in private collections refer cryptically to instructions from above or commissions authorized by him without ever naming the individual. The fact that the final journal entry of Murphy and Donovan echoed this language at the moment of their apparent deaths suggests that their fear of the master was not merely theatrical. The discovery of the bodies in Veracruz made international headlines at the time, though quickly suppressed in American Catholic newspapers. Mexican journalists reported rumors that the mansion where they were found had hosted lavish gatherings attended by foreign businessmen, clerics, and local officials. The journal confirmed at least a partial continuation of the trafficking model established at St. Mary's, with references to commissions from Havana, New Orleans, and even San Francisco as late as 1879. That such operations could persist undetected, or deliberately ignored, underscored the persistence of the network even after the Wisconsin exposure. La Verdad de Veracruz described the two women as seated like queens presiding over a court of shadows, their skeletal hands folded in their laps while the teacups before them bore silent testimony to an ending chosen or imposed. American authorities declined to claim the bodies officially, though private correspondence between the U.S. consulate and the State Department confirms awareness of their identities. The consulate noted delicately that the women appeared to have been connected to certain scandals of long memory in Wisconsin and Chicago and recommended no further action. The remains were buried in a common cemetery in Veracruz without ceremony, their graves unmarked. Within a generation the site was forgotten, but the journal entered the possession of a Mexican priest who recognized its significance. It resurfaced only in the 1960s when fragments were translated by researchers at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. Their publication in a limited academic journal reignited interest in the long-buried scandal. For survivors, the news brought grim closure. Sister Rebecca, by then an elderly laywoman living under the name Rachel Martin, reportedly wept upon reading the translated extracts. According to a niece, she whispered they never escaped, not truly, before retreating into silence once again. For others, the discovery only deepened the mystery. If Murphy and Donovan had indeed operated for decades in Mexico, who protected them? Who profited and what became of the women trafficked through their hands. Mexican police reports hinted at foreign clients whose names were excised from the public record, possibly by diplomatic request. The master remained the most troubling figure of all. Sister Elizabeth's notebook claimed he demanded sacrifices in exchange for protection. Callahan in his last confession warned that he was not someone you wanted knowing you. In the final entry of the Veracruz Journal, he comes tonight, we have failed him for the last time, reads as both confession and curse. Scholars continue to debate whether this referred to divine retribution, a powerful patron, or perhaps a delusion cultivated by years of secrecy and guilt. Yet the persistence of the phrase across independent documents strongly suggests the women and their accomplices truly feared a tangible figure, one whose identity may remain forever lost beneath layers of destroyed archives, burned records, and whispered warnings. What is clear is that the St. Mary's case was not an isolated eruption of evil, but part of a larger clandestine economy exploiting the aura of sanctity for profit and pleasure. The Wisconsin convent merely provided the template: remote location, unquestioned authority, a population of women bound by vows of silence and obedience. Wealthy men who wished to indulge forbidden fantasies could find in such institutions both opportunity and secrecy. The tragedy lies not only in the crimes committed but in the deliberate erasure that followed, ensuring that the victim's suffering would be hidden for generations. And yet fragments survive: a notebook sewn into a mattress, a water-stained letter never sent, a journal abandoned in Veracruz. Each fragment challenges the silence, each whispers across time that what was suffered mattered. Father Ryan's plea to remember them remains unfulfilled in official histories, but echoes still in the margins of archives and in the hearts of those who stumble upon their story. The master, whoever he was, may have silenced the perpetrators, but he could not silence memory, for memory is the final rebellion against erasure and the last fragile justice for the lost women of St. Mary's. But remembrance, as fragile as it is, carries with it a burden. For every name recorded, countless more remain lost in silence, women and children whose identities vanished into ledgers marked only with initials, or whose lives ended beneath unmarked earth. St. Mary's was not merely a place where vows were betrayed. It was a machine that consumed innocence, ground it into silence, and converted it into currency for the powerful. The fact that fragments of the truth survive at all is a testament not only to Sister Mary's bravery, but to the persistence of ordinary families like the Fletchers, who refused to allow the official narrative to suffocate memory. And yet, questions linger. What became of the children sold through these hidden channels, scattered across the Midwest, raised in homes oblivious to their origins? How many descendants today unknowingly carry bloodlines tied to St. Mary's, their family stories amputated by secrecy? Genealogists who attempt to trace these lineages often encounter inexplicable gaps in baptismal records, sudden disappearances in census entries, and entire family branches swallowed by administrative erasures. It is as if someone, decade after decade, ensured that the shadows remained intact. Even the earth itself seems reluctant to give up all its secrets. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar surveys commissioned by independent researchers identified several anomalies beneath farmland near the original convent site. Though county officials refused excavation permits, citing respect for sacred ground, the imaging suggested the presence of subterranean voids, possibly collapsed cellars or hidden burial chambers. Local rumor holds that a vault once extended beneath the convent chapel, a space whispered about by surviving sisters as the lower room, where punishments and rituals were carried out beyond the sight of visitors. If such a chamber exists, it may yet hold artifacts or remains capable of rewriting the accepted history. Meanwhile, the Church maintains its silence. Official diocesan statements refer to unverified claims, dismissing the most damning evidence as products of anti-Catholic hysteria common in the 19th century. But the consistency of survivor testimonies, the persistence of independent archival discoveries, and the repeated pattern of missing or destroyed records tell another story, one of deliberate obfuscation. When power is threatened by truth, memory itself becomes a battleground. For those who seek to preserve that memory, the struggle is ongoing. Each recovered document, each oral history passed down, each relic unearthed is an act of defiance against the forces of erasure. The silver cross in the Fletcher farmhouse kitchen is not just a family heirloom, it is a declaration. The handwritten lists of names, painstakingly copied, guarded, whispered, are weapons against oblivion. And the small box unearthed in 2018, with its haunting inscription "Remember Us," is perhaps the most potent testimony of all, a direct appeal across time, demanding witness. The story of St. Mary's is not finished, because history buried alive has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Whether in documents smuggled from locked archives, in whispered family legends, or in restless echoes carried on autumn winds, the truth insists on being heard. And so the question passes to us, the living: will we honor that truth, or allow it once more to be swallowed by silence? Remember them. Speak their names. Refuse to let the soil close over their stories. For in that act of remembrance, fragile though it may be, lies the only form of justice still possible.